Hi, and welcome back to Why Eating Healthy is Not Enough. I'm here today with Dr. Kenneth Pelletier, professor of medicine, integrative medicine pioneer who specializes in the field of epigenetics. Dr. Kenneth, welcome. Maybe you could start by just telling us how you got into doing the work that you do. The field of epigenetics is so fascinating, and I'd love to hear what led you to it.
Well, thank you for the invitation. As far as epigenetics, it really came out of work. My main research area is working with large corporations and developing interventions for clinical and cost outcomes. And I've had a program for 30 years of working with Ford, Lockheed Martin, Prudential, PepsiCo, Apple, American Airlines. And we meet twice a year. And the medical directors about 7 or 8 years ago began asking me if they should include genetic testing in their annual executive physicals. And I said, I have no idea, because when I was in medical school, epigenetics or genetics consisted of Watson and Crick, double-stranded DNA, DNA to RNA replication, end of lecture. So I had to go back and relearn everything about genetics, which is an extremely difficult subject. And as I did that, what I realized is that genetics, as I was taught it, is not at all what we know now about epigenetics, which is how we modify our genetic inheritance with our behaviors, with our lifestyles.
Very interesting. So it wasn't really your own personal journey, because a lot of people come to their work for their own health reasons. But for yours, it was really, you were just tasked with figuring this out.
Well, if I go back further, the personal part of it is when I was in medical school, I dropped out for a year and I lived in Zurich. And I lived there because I wanted to travel, and went to the Near East, North Africa, all through Europe. And anyway, during the travels, I actually ended up on a little island, Tinos, in the Greek archipelago. And Tinos is like Lourdes is for the Christian faith. Tinos is for the Greek Orthodox. And there's a little chapel where a miracle supposedly occurred. And I happened to be there when pilgrims were descending on this island. I had no idea what was going on, except suddenly this deserted little island was alive with people. And I didn't see eyes or limbs regenerate, but I did see people that would go into this little chapel in extreme pain and come out laughing and moving and animated, people with gnarled limbs, able to use their hands, able to walk upright, people with intestinal tract problems and excruciating pain that emerged pain-free. So that was just not the biology that I was learning. And when I came back to UCSF, that's what began to make me think about what is this interaction between mind and body that helps us to attain health, that helps us overcome adversity and even reverse advanced disease. And that's been my driving question ever since.
Wow, that sounds extremely compelling. So, how much of our health expression would you say is based on genetics, and how much is this mind-body piece, our beliefs, our, the expression part?
Well, it's a great question. Right now, the greatest misconception about genetics is that it's like the hard drive on a computer. It's an invariant set of laws that govern everything from height, weight, eye color, to diseases you will contract, to how long you will live. And it turns out that that's only 5% of what we experience as adults. So 95% of what we experience as adults in terms of, honestly, life expectancy, health, disease, optimal health, ability to cope with various forms of illness is really dependent on genetic expression. So the gene is unchanged. My book title is a kind of a gotcha title because genes don't change. They can be damaged. They can be damaged by radiation, by petrochemicals, by herbicides like Roundup, very deadly herbicide, carcinogenic. But they can be damaged, but they can't be changed. So who you were at birth is the same person now. What does change is the expression. And whether that gene becomes active or not is dependent on diet, stress, lifestyle, environmental exposure, belief systems, meditation, stress, That's what to me is so fascinating, is that we regulate our genes as much more than they regulate us.
Wow. All right. And so I'm almost afraid to ask this next question, and that is, so if we can damage genes, can we also heal genes?
Yes. Well, what we can do is we can regulate the gene. So if a gene is damaged by, say, radiation or herbicides or lightning, electricity, if someone is electrocuted, you can't undo that damage of the gene itself, but what you can influence is, does it get expressed or not? So you may have a gene that suddenly gets altered and produces a great deal of inflammation in your body, which is destructive at very high levels. It's heart disease and irritable bowel syndrome and rheumatoid arthritis, those kinds of conditions. But there are things with diet, with stress, with environment, with physical activity you can do to bring that inflammation within an optimal range. And that's really what we're talking about with epigenetics. It's not a disease prediction model. Like 23andMe says, oh, you've got this profile, you've got a 40% likelihood of some condition. I don't like that model. I object because it doesn't tell you about the 60% of the people who have the same profile and don't have that disease. And it doesn't tell you how to shift from 40% risk to 60% optimal health. My preference is what we call optimal biomarkers. So it's a range within which you want all of your biological functions to be. And when they're in that range, you will have optimal health. You'll have extended life expectancy, even, which is always a surprise for people. But we actually have a profound influence over how long we will live.
Right. All right. Next question. And this is a little controversial, maybe, but what do you think about cutting off body parts preemptively to prevent disease?
I object because usually it's based on genetic markers and on disease prediction. And again, we don't know enough about disease prediction based on biomarkers to make that kind of recommendation to a patient. So a person may have a 70 or 80% risk as breast cancer, as an example. But there's a great deal you can do with that. You can change your diet, you can do meditations, you can engage in physical activity. There are chemoprophylaxis agents that you can take. You can increase your screening interval. You can do breast self-exam. You can do thermography. So those are just maybe 5 or 6 instances of what you can do that you can stay in charge. And in fact, if surgery is the last resort, if it's absolutely essential, then of course, yes, I'm supportive to that. But the preemptive, basically excision of body parts based on predictive genetic assessments is premature. It just isn't accurate enough to govern or warrant that kind of extreme intervention.
Yeah, well, that makes a lot of sense. So, another thing, a lot of the experts on the summit have talked a lot about how stress affects our health, how it interacts with thyroid and autoimmune disease. Maybe you could say a little bit about how that works. Like, how does stress affect our genetic expression? Shine a
Yeah,
light on that.
Yeah, well, there really are 2 kinds of stress. Maybe other people have talked about this, but my very early research identified as type 1 stress, which is short-term, immediate, identifiable, and resolvable. So if you think about it, it's a physical threat. You almost fall down and you go, oh, and you catch yourself and you feel this spike of adrenaline and your corticotrophic hormones are increased and electrical activity in your brain. And that doesn't feel very pleasant, but there's no problem with that. We need that to survive. Then there's the type 2 stress, which is destructive. And it's when the source of stress is not immediate, not identifiable, or resolvable. What happens there is we don't get the peak and we don't get the trough. So we never get to fully recover. So heart rate stays elevated, electrical activity in the brain stays elevated, all of our hormones are elevated. All of that basically has an effect at a cellular level. And the genes that reside in every cell in our body are affected by that ocean of changes. So if you have catabolic or energy mobilization biochemistry going on in your cell, which is what you do when you have extreme prolonged stress, that has an adverse effect on that genetic expression. And it will increase inflammation. It will reduce detoxification capacity of the genetic expression. So the direct measurable impact of the type 2 stress is very destructive. And the trick, if you will, to change type 2 to type 1 is to have any form of relaxation or meditation practice. There are hundreds of forms of meditation. There's yoga, Pilates, you name it. Something that we do that breaks that cumulative cycle is the way to avoid that cumulative damage.
So it sounds like relaxation really is the most powerful form of medicine. Is that accurate, or?
Well, my bias is yes, in the sense of that the human mind-body system, the human body has an incredible capacity for regeneration. Homeostasis is the principle that a body left to its own will rebalance itself to a state of health. We interfere with that. We interfere with that with our diets. We interfere with that with sedentary living, with too much pharmacology, with excessive surgery, with an environment that's toxic. So we're interfering. Our birthright for the vast majority of individuals is to be optimally healthy. There are genetic disorders and there are other kinds of conditions that arise, but by and large, the vast majority of us are intended to be healthy, and we disrupt that tendency. So if we just basically relax, literally relax, let our body chemistry heal, restore the balance, that is a very powerful influence on our health and longevity.
It's so funny. One of my long held beliefs is that bodies are designed to heal.
Ah,
And it sounds like, I mean, getting out of our own way is the trick, right? Like,
yes.
and the question is, how do we get out of our own way? And I guess it sounds like the answer is to just stop thinking about it and relax.
Well, in some ways, yes, I agree with your philosophy. I had a patient one time to say, for years, my doctor told me to relax, but he never told me how. Okay, so the trick is the how. And the how is to then pick any practice. All of us have some way of knowing when we're under excess stress. We get a dry mouth, we get a tense neck, we feel our thoughts racing, we get cold, clammy hands, we get a clenching in our back, something that tells us you're over the limit, you are stressed. And that's a signal to our biology, or you're holding your breath, you're hyperventilating. It's a very common one. It tells us we're pushing our body system way too hard. So whenever that happens, you pick anything, and I mean literally anything that you can focus on. It could be a word, a prayer, a sound, a sight, a smell, a memory, doesn't matter what it is. Pick that and focus on it. And let the good feeling that comes from that, it could be a word, a mantra, it could be a place you visited as a child or on vacation. Really see that, re-experience the pleasure, really experience the happiness and the joy of that one few seconds, and you will respond, that your whole mind-body system will shift. Laughter. Literally, when you laugh, you have an instantaneous shifting from a type 2 to a type 1 stress response. In a matter of microseconds, your body changes from a destructive catabolic state to an anabolic regenerative state just by laughing. So when all else fails, laugh.
Wow. It's really hitting me like this. What you just said is probably the main point of this whole summit is, like, how do we do it? We know that food isn't enough, but what can we do? And that right there, I think you said it beautifully.
Well, there's an interesting research study out of Harvard. It actually came out after my book came out, so I don't have it in there. But there was a study that was done looking at meditators after 12 weeks and looked at the fact that their epigenetic expression was all improved after 12 weeks. And that was a number, maybe 5 or 6 years ago. Then a couple of years ago, some smart graduate student at Harvard said, well, if it happens in 10 to 12 weeks, how rapidly can it happen? So right? So he looked at about 15 meditators and did an epigenetic assay before and after 20 minutes of meditation. And he found that all of their epigenetic markers had moved in a healthy direction after 15 minutes of a basic breathing meditation. So now that doesn't mean we can breathe for 15 minutes and all is well, but it does mean that we can do it. It does happens in a matter of seconds. And if we sustain it over time, that's the trick, is sustaining whatever practice we have, be it dietary, meditation, exercise. When we sustain it over time, that's when the change happens. That's when we experience optimal health. That's when we extend our life expectancy.
I want to ask about autoimmune disease. So a lot of people that are struggling with autoimmune disease, it's become so real to them. Like, this is their life experience. And one of the questions is how to shift the belief that healing is possible for people in these chronic states. And how effective is this meditation and relaxation to helping reverse autoimmune disease from a genetic standpoint?
Right. Well, it depends on where in the continuum with autoimmune diseases. So if you have arthritic damage from rheumatoid arthritis in your 60s or 70s or younger, the likelihood you're going to, quote, reverse that is unlikely. But there is some, just taking rheumatoid issues as an example, Dr. Kate Lorig, who's a professor of medicine at Stanford, a colleague, she has done research for probably 20 years on rheumatoid arthritic patients, and demonstrating that through group practices of exercise, dietary change, meditation, relaxation, she gets as much pain relief and as much reduction in inflammation as any anti-inflammatory drug. So it's definitely possible. And I guess my advice to anyone is you have to try it. It's trial and error. So if you know, for instance, you can reduce the inflammatory foods in your diet. Meditation certainly reduces inflammation. It will allow the body to restore and regenerate. If you can only do a minimal amount of physical activity, do that activity and notice that week to week, month to month, your movement might be extended. It might be a little more fluid. It might be a little less painful. But all of these small incremental movements toward positive health, trial and error, keep sustaining that change, you can make a difference. There's no question about the fact you can make a difference.
Well, it's very encouraging. And so relaxation is part of it, but maybe you could say something about diet too. How big of an impact would you say diet is in terms of health compared to the mind-body piece?
Well, in the epigenetics area, the one place where we have the most research is on the dietary impact on the gene expression. That's the largest area, largest body of research. So from a research perspective, I'd say diet is the single most important impact. And there are, this is more detailed than you need, but there are basically 7 biochemical pathways in the body. All of them are governed by genetic expression, and all of them determine whether we're healthy or ill. And they're methylation, inflammation, oxidative stress, detoxification. All of these things are governed by the dietary changes we can make. Now, setting that aside, if you look at the mind-body research, it's more limited because it's new. The whole area of epigenetic research is quite new. But if you look at the mind-body interaction, you find that the most epigenetic variables, if changed by a single factor, is changed through stress management or meditation. So I think as we look into the future, we'll see that that has a huge impact. The other is the microbiome, or the intestinal tract. Everything from our mouth to the anus is the microbiome. And there are 40 to 100 trillion cells, 40 to 100 trillion cells, microbes, viruses in the human intestinal tract. That's 100 times more cells than the entire human body. And what we're finding out is the role of stress, the role of depression, the role of diet in linking the intestinal tract to the human brain. It's been called the brain-gut connection, but it's very clear that what our minds experience show up in our gut, our intestinal tract, and what the intestinal tract is experiencing is showing up in our minds. So we have this very intimate mind-body connection. So the dietary and stress is really inseparable in many ways. I think we're going to find that in the future.
Yeah, so true. I think about the gut biome as the new frontier. I mean, at one time it was the Wild West, then it was the oceans, then it was outer space. Now it's the human biome, right?
I think that's very true. And for women, it's even more important. So we have 40 to 100 trillion cells in the average male. For women, if you include reproductive organs, you have tens of hundreds of millions more cells. So for women, this exploration of the microbiome, and the microbiome is affected most profoundly by nutrition and by environmental exposure. So for women, it becomes an even more important issue than from your garden variety male.
Very, very, very interesting. Well, Dr. Pelletier, I could sit here all day and talk to you. This has been so interesting. I'm just thrilled by what you've shared today. I know our viewers will be too. And I know you have a free gift. The link will be down below this video. And any last words of advice for our viewers? If they could focus on one thing, what would that be?
Well, to me, the one thing would be to urge everyone to develop a meditative or a quieting practice, because when we go inside and we reach that point of equanimity, of balance, it's before thought, before emotions, before physical matter, it is the place from which we make decisions. And those decisions determine everything, literally, the quality of our life day to day, the quality of health that we will experience, and the quantity of life we will lead. And to me, that's the single most important practice that anyone can engage in. And from that place, make enlightened decisions.
Fabulous. Fabulous, sage advice. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I hope all of you have gotten as much out of this as I have. And we will see you on the next video.
Thank you.